we will be starting from birth of Christ, Christianity, because that is a dominant force up until today, including today, and of course it influenced philosophy a lot, and it's impossible not to talk about it, especially in the philosophy class. So, birth of Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth is, of course, the leading figure. Historians tell us that he actually, even though we count considering, well, there's no year 0, but there's year 1, and that's like a first year after birth of Christ, and so on. But historians tell us that he probably was actually born a little bit earlier than that, around 4 years before Christ, which is ironic, but that's because at the time when they set up this calendar, they did not have as good of a tools to investigate this as historians today have. And so they made a little bit of a mistake. They got a little bit off in terms of even though it is still approximate. Of course, we are not 100% sure, but more or less historians today think that Jesus of Nazareth was born around 4 BC, and he was indeed crucified somewhere between year 30 and 33 Anno Domini, our time. How do we know? What do we know about Jesus of Nazareth? Well, the main source is 4 canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are written by anonymous authors, even though there are some suggestions that perhaps indeed some of the apostles had to do something with it and so on. We do not know for a fact who is the author. However, they do give us quite a bit of information. Now, how historical reliable is this information? Well, that is where you have 2 ways to answer these kinds of questions. One of them is, of course, through the religious belief, and the other one through historical evidence. Religious belief is that this is the word of God, so everything there is true. Historical evidence, well, we are not sure, of course, about whether or not everything there is historically reliable. How they square off, again, it will be a big question in philosophy. Kierkegaard in particular will have interesting things to say about that when we get to Kierkegaard. Probably talk about it a little bit more. But nonetheless, this is 2 different approaches, historical approach and religious approach. Of course, we, since it's a philosophy class, have to keep in mind religious approach, but since it is college and not religious seminary, we will have to look at the historical evidence very closely too. General scholarly consensus is that Jesus was a contemporary of John the Baptist, indeed, and was indeed crucified in around that time by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was kind of like the Rome was ruling these territories by appointing governors who were kind of in charge, but in the same time there was local authority. So Judea, where Jesus was crucified, was of course a Jewish land at the time. Jerusalem still is Jewish land today, but today they reestablished it because it was lost to Jewish people for many, actually thousands of years. But some thousands of years, more than 1,000 years. Anyway, and Rome was controlling it, but wasn't deciding everything. So there is a famous part in the New Testament where Pontius Pilate actually was kind of unwilling to crucify Jesus, because he thought, well, why do we have to do that? And the local Jewish authorities were really outraged by his teachings, and they said, no, we want him crucified. And that is kind of a famous thing where Pontius Pilate washed his hands. He said, well, if you want to do that, whatever. So essentially, one of the reasons why historically Jewish people got a lot of blame for this, well, whether it's justified or not is of course not the question we want to discuss, but in any case, that is what the Bible tells us, the New Testament. Anyway, after Jesus' death, his followers did say that he arose from the dead. And that is the essence, of course, of his of the belief in Jesus. What ensued in terms of the Gospels being written and Christianity being born. Jesus arose from the dead, miraculous fact which has reconfirmed his status as a son of God and divine creature. Now, historically, of course, we do not have reliable evidence to support that. This is all in the Gospels, so if you believe in that, you believe in that, and if you don't, there's no way to check that. Okay, so this is more or less on the birth of Christ. Now, what was happening with the Christianity? Of course, Christianity at first was very much it was a persecuted, small persecuted movement which was slowly growing. They had quite a bit of concern about what to do. For one thing, we don't know very much about it today, don't think about it very much today, but early Christians expected Jesus to come back anytime soon. At first there was no, right now nobody expects Jesus to come back soon, or at least most people don't. At the time they thought he was going to come back. In fact, during their lifetime, he will come back. And so they had to prepare for his second coming. That was one of the important concerns they had. The second one is they were persecuted. In fact, for the first 300 years, more or less, until Emperor Constantine took power in Rome, and he ruled between 305 and 337, the Christians were persecuted. They were not the main religion. In fact, they were considered dangerous because they did proclaim Christ and not the emperor as the Lord over the earth. And that was considered a type of rebellion against the emperor. And they felt it as their duty to evangelize the world, to spread the word of God. Another concern they had, which was important, is to fight the heresies. That was very, very important to begin with. Heresy is the Greek word for choice, and it actually meant different varieties of Christianity, different varieties of belief. Well, problem of faith and reason, which is something, again, which becomes part of philosophy ever since that time and until today. It was not relevant to the Greeks, because Greeks believed in reason. To them, faith did not interfere with reason in any way. Was also not relevant to the Jews, because for them faith was the way to go, and reason they did not take into consideration. Now, from this time on, there is definitely a tension between faith and reason, because for early Christians, such questions as, is Christian belief rational, became very important. And if you guys did the reading, you noticed some of this in the work of Augustine, and later on, when we talk about Aquinas, it will become a big part of his work. So Christians tried to reconcile the reason and this Greek heritage with faith, with the Gospels, the Word of God, and so on. What is the relations between faith and reason? Should your reason control your faith? Should your faith control your reason? Can they peacefully coexist? Do they actually interfere with each other? This is, like I said, one of the core questions of philosophy ever since. Can one coherently embrace both roads to the truth? So can you, on one hand, read the Bible, believe the word of the Bible, on the other hand, use reason as a guide in life? Because you probably noticed that it's not always easy. Religious people do have to answer many questions for themselves, and sometimes reason leads us in a different direction than the Bible. So one of the examples is evolution, right? We have been struggling with that for, a couple of hundred years now, ever since Darwin has suggested that this is what actually happened. And that, of course, is not exactly what Bible says. So for people of faith, it was important to reconcile them and somehow answer the questions about evolution in the same time, without interfering with science, without declining the science and the reason, but keep the Bible intact too, and that it's a word of God, so that must have happened this way rather than through evolution. That's some of the concerns of the period, and they were very relevant to them. Challenging heresies and clarifying orthodoxy. Now, at first, when the teachings of Christian religion appeared, they were not, of course, very settled, right? Even today, they're not completely settled. You see different religious denominations, even Christians, disagree over many issues. The biggest ones among Catholics, Orthodox, Protestant religions, this is like the major disagreements. There is also disagreements within them, like Protestants. They not all agree on many issues. At the time, it was even worse, because they really had to put everything together from scratch. They did not have any kind of unified approach, and they were trying to produce this unified approach. So for several hundred years, even more than 700 years, that created a lot of tension, and there were many different opinions, which again, heresies. This is what we call heresy, from the Greek word choice, for choice, or opinion. Different opinions on the same subject, and some of the most important subjects we will mention today, but they, again, even today are not completely settled. There are, however, more or less unified answers to them within the Christian world today, whereas back then they were completely divisive. Now we have to talk a little bit about Neoplatonism, even though that's considered part of this pagan philosophy, but Neoplatonism had a huge influence on Christianity, and for this reason we do have to mention it a little bit. So it did take place roughly between 3rd and 6th century, already our time. 3rd century, very dismal period in Roman history. That's right before the fall of Rome. Weakened army, barbarian invasions, and Augustine, who was the reading for today and who we'll talk about more today, has actually happened to live right at that time. So his work is a reflection of that turbulent period. Longing for salvation, absorption into God. People were basically trying to find a way out of this mess, explain for themselves what's going on, where should they go. Neoplatonism is, of course, based on Platonism, as its name suggests. In fact, at the time they didn't call themselves Neoplatonists, they called themselves Platonists. They thought of themselves as just being faithful to the teachings of Plato. Today we call them Neoplatonists mainly because they do have some differences with Plato as far as we understand it. But to them it seemed like a natural development of Plato's ideas. What we talked about earlier in Plato, you can still kind of see it's there. There's more because they tried to not only take Plato's teaching, but kind of take it one step further, explain some of the things they thought Plato did not explain very clearly. So it kind of became a mix of Pythagorean, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Platonic themes. Stoicism, which we talked about before, some of the ideas of Aristotle, they were all there. Some of the major figures of Platonism: Plotinus, he is kind of a founding figure, lived between 205 and 270. His pupil Porphyry. Porphyry was the author of the famous Enneads, which is the book of the teaching of Plotinus. He kind of tried to more or less summarize the whole thing and put it in as a single teaching. So he, in that sense, is even more interesting than Porphyry. He was also the figure who had most influence on Augustine. He lived around 232-305 our time. And finally Plutarch and Proclus at Athens. Later on, there's two other major figures of Neoplatonism. So this is more or less the Neoplaton religion, the teaching. It was not a religion, philosophy, how they looked at everything. So at the top they got like this idea of levels, and it's kind of like a pyramid, like this kind of a pyramid with the one or absolute unity at the top. And the one is like the Platonic good. Remember the Platonic good, the sun which is outside the cave? So that's basically what it is. That is the source of all goodness, the one. Now the first emanation from that would be the being, existence, or intellect, Platonic forms. If you did the reading, especially if you did the entire reading, you notice that there is definitely strong influence of this in Augustine's work, especially towards the end of it. Then the soul. The soul is kind of intermediary between this being, which is pure intellect, the forms. Remember the forms? Those kind of abstract prototypes of everything. Now, how are they related to individual souls and the world soul? That is through the soul. This is kind of first emanation from that. Then organisms, living organisms, that's kind of lower level. Bodies, even lower level. And the lowest level of all of this is matter. Matter actually is not really existence. It is more of a lack of existence. And that is kind of how they looked at things. So again, the one or the good at the top of everything, that would be the highest being, the highest unity. You may say it is God. They never specifically addressed the one as God, but essentially this is where the connection between Neoplatonism and Christianity later begins. The one as God, transcendent and incomprehensible. Transcendent meaning it's not part of this world. It's somewhere outside the world. Incomprehensible, we cannot understand what exactly it is. It's not engaged in any activity. Now, in that sense, it's more of an Aristotelian type of unmoved mover. And all things, however, emanate from it, which is not Aristotelian idea. Remember, Aristotle didn't think that the unmoved mover actually participated in creation of the world, but in this case the one did kind of originate the world. Everything emanated from it. They use the word which is translated in English as emanation, or kind of, well, I don't know what other word to use to explain it. Hopefully you guys understand what it means. They try to express it in a way that things are kind of, even though they originate from the one, but the one did not create them, did not do anything. It's just they kind of well, anyway, emanated. That's probably the best word anyway. Now the matter again is on the bottom of everything, and it is the source of evil. The matter is the source of evil. However, everything physical still shares at least some goodness with the source in a certain degree, because it's not just matter, right? Matter does have a little bit of God in it, and so that is the spirit, which kind of is a good part, but matter itself is a bad and evil part. Naturally, the further you go from the one, the less goodness you have, because if you go back to this pyramid and look at it, this is the absolute goodness, so this is already a little bit less of goodness. Less. So matter at the very bottom, naturally it would have like virtually no goodness at all. But overall, they would say cosmos is like a beautiful painting or a well-written play. Each part has a role to play, including the evil part. Evil part is necessary to emphasize the good part. We do strive for salvation in the end of everything, so we have to purify ourselves through intellectual and moral discipline, learn to see the forms, just like Plato was suggesting we should do, see the beauty in everything, including ourselves, engage in philosophical dialectic, and in the end of the day unite with God, which would be our salvation. So this is Neoplatonism. It had a huge influence on Christianity, partly because you see the timeline, it was like right there together with Christianity. A lot of the people who are considered to be important figures of Christianity were very familiar with Neoplatonism, influenced by it, including Origen, that's one of the earlier figures, St. Augustine, who we'll talk about today, and Boetius, that's a little bit later figure, again a Roman who was very well knowledgeable in Greek philosophy, and really tragic figure, executed for his beliefs, considered to be another one of the early fathers of the church, so to say. Okay, let's talk about Augustine now. So, who was Augustine? He was born 354 in North Africa, Carthage, around Carthage. It wasn't actually, he wasn't born in Carthage, but around that area. It's like, today it's North Africa, back then it was also Roman. Christian mother, his father was not Christian, but mother was Christian. She wanted him to become Christian her entire life. At the time it was already kind of mixed, because Christianity already was a dominant religion. It was already official religion in Rome. But in the same time, there was still a lot of, like I said, this battle between Christianity and other beliefs. A lot of people did not accept Christianity, and so on. So his mother wanted him to become Christian. He himself will become Christian only as a grown man. At first he studied rhetoric in Carthage, taught rhetoric for a while, and he joined one of the heresies, one of the sects of the period, Manichaeans. Manichaeans were kind of loosely similar to Christianity, but they accepted Christ, but they had their own explanation about everything. They had this idea of God of light and versus God of darkness, and how they are battling. And the God of darkness is the one who actually creates all the evil, whereas God of light creates all the good, and so on. He was with them for a period, but after about 9 years, he got disillusioned with Manichaean religion and went into skepticism. Remember skepticism? So he basically decided you cannot know these things. You cannot know them. So therefore, shouldn't commit yourself to any particular belief. Then in 384 he became professor of rhetoric in Milan, and around that time he began reading the Neoplatonists. Porphyry in particular, Neoplatonists we just talked about a few minutes ago. So he was actually influenced by this, and this is what moved him, among other things, towards Christianity, because he thought Christianity actually embraced all this and gave best answers to the questions he had. Gave him the rejoicement of his mother, moved him towards the correct direction, and he converted to Christianity 386, 387, around this time. So 32 years old. That's how old he was at the time when he converted. By the way, how do we know about it? He wrote a book called Confessions, which actually is his biography. Very detailed, excellent source of information explaining how he lived when he was younger, how did he get to Christianity, and so on. Wonderful source. I wish you guys could read it too, but I mean, there's only so much I can assign as reading. So anyway, it is a very long book too. Bishop of Hippo from 386 for over 30 years. He became a bishop of Hippo. That's another city in North Africa. Eventually, he died in 430, just as barbarians were advancing. Barbarians sacked Rome a few years before that, and they also have gotten to Hippo, North Africa, and were at the gates of the city just as he was already so old that he was dying from old age. So he died without knowing what was happening later. This is a kind of a nice little illustration, even though obviously made more than 1,000 years later, but still kind of gives you a little bit of an idea how you can imagine St. Augustine in his study. Just looking at the window, a cat is sitting here. It's kind of a nice picture. Anyway, major works, well, he wrote quite a lot, but like I said, one of his major works is Confessions. This is basically his biography. He talks about his entire life, his conversion, and so on. The other major work we'll talk about in the end a little bit, City of God. That's like a huge book talking about Rome. Now, let's talk a little bit about the reading. I hope you guys did the reading. It is very, very interesting. On the freedom of the will. There was actually a question about freedom of the will, although it was in another section. We did kind of briefly discuss it, so I thought that will be an interesting reading for you. So let's see who did the reading, if anybody did that. What it is to do evil. How does he answer that in the beginning? Can anybody say what it is to do evil? We barely use the word. So this is the gist of the entire work. We have a free will. And you can will in two directions, basically. You can pursue good, or you can pursue evil. this is what we can do freely, and we can choose either one we want. What does it mean to pursue good? Eternal things. Eternal things. Whereas evil would be changing things. So wherever we direct ourselves, that kind of is up to us, but pursuing good things would lead to happiness, and pursuing these evil things would lead to unhappiness. Now, then he further qualifies eternal things as he talks about it being mathematical truth, but essentially in numbers, and it is God in the end of the day, because God is the truth. And just like for Plato, for him the truth does not change. The truth is like 2 + 2 = 4. It's always equal 4. So that's why he says the numbers are again kind of a part of this divine structure of the world. And you see it in Plato, you see him saying essentially the same things, whereas all the changing things here, everything material essentially. And he even lists such things as body, freedom, or our idea of freedom, and he says family and friends also are here, and he says this state is here, and he says honors, pleasures, and property are all kind of here. They are essentially well, you can't say the family itself is evil, but to prefer family to God, to prefer your family to the truth is evil. Your preference should always be here. You should choose these eternal divine things, which is also note that, for example, in priesthood, at least some denominations consider the priest should not have a family. Why? Well, because he's dedicated to God. And if you have a family, you are distracted. So whether or not this is actually the way Christians should behave is still question of dispute even today. And you see the Catholic priests, for example, dedicating themselves to God and then molesting little children. I mean, that's obviously, again, would be going here. But the idea is only unchanging eternal truths is what you should prefer. And this is how it is for Augustine. And this is the gist of the reading, at least the whole work. In the whole work, he basically talks about how you should always prefer God to everything. And preferring God just means going towards these eternal things. Now, who causes the movement of the will from unchangeable to changeable things? That's towards the end of the reading. It's a third book, which actually why I switched the reading at some point, because I realized I can't give you all 3 books, but then I found this extraction which had bits of the first and second book and the third book. And the third book is, of course, the most important here. Well, yeah, you may say ourselves or our soul. So our will is a little bit more correct. Our will does have a power to choose between unchangeable and changeable things. He's very clear on that. We have a freedom in that sense. We can choose unchangeable things or changeable things. And then the question, of course, becomes why? Why God gave us this power? So this is again towards the end of the reading, but he gives very interesting answers, because that other guy who he is talking to in a dialogue is supposedly asking him, how can God foreknowledge of the future, and yet we do not sin by necessity? So his idea is that if God knows already what we will do, and the God is all-powerful, how come then he allows us to do whatever? And if he foreknows, if he knows already what we will do bad things, does it mean that they are kind of necessary, that they already are determined? Because otherwise, how could he know that? So, did you understand the answer he gives to these questions? Well, the foreknowledge is just knowing ahead of time. So, essentially, the idea here is, suppose somebody tomorrow will make a free decision. Like somebody, you guys now deciding, am I going to, after college, am I going to become a lawyer or am I going to become a doctor or whatever? right? So you at this point, as far as you are concerned, you don't know. And you think you have a free choice, you can be either. But God already knows that you will, for example, become a lawyer. Does that mean then that you don't have any choice? That since He already knows that, that's already determined? And so Augustine answers this question. He basically says that no, it's completely compatible. You have a free choice, and yet God knows ahead of time. It's like saying the knowledge of that something will happen does not take away the free choice, right? You observe somebody doing some things, he's making these free choices. So if you think about it a few years later, you will already know what he chose. Does that mean he did not have a free choice? No, he had a free choice. It's just that you know about it. And since God is outside of time, so he immediately knows the future. For him, it's not the future. For him, everything is present. He knows the past and the future simultaneously, right? So he knows what will happen. But that still doesn't mean that you don't have a free choice. That is his answer about the foreknowledge. He is basically saying it is completely compatible. There is no incompatibility between God knowing and us still having free choice. Then another question becomes, how come we do have a free choice? Doesn't it mean that God gives us ability to do evil things? And how could he if he is the best and the nicest and the most beautiful thing? And so the answer he gives there towards the end, also he kind of says, well, suppose there are like 3 levels of things. Imagine that there are people who can sin but don't, people who can sin but do, and people who cannot sin at all. They just don't have this choice. And he's saying that if you think about it, you will understand that people who can sin but don't is the highest one of the 3. And they are higher than people who can sin and do sin. But even people who can sin and do sin are still higher than people who cannot sin, who don't even have this choice. So if God didn't give us this choice, we would not even be humans. We would be like stones. You know, a stone, you let it go and it falls down, and that's it. It has no freedom. So essentially, God giving us freedom is in itself this great thing. And so for this reason, even though we sometimes use it to do evil things, that still is better than if we had no choice whatsoever. So that is his explanation there. Okay, authority and reason is rather important for Augustine too, because he already believes in reason, and he is trying to square it off with authority. A lot of influence from Plato, from the Greeks, in terms of the reason. He actually does say in another work that none of the other philosophers has come so close to us as being Christians as the Platonists have. So he thinks that they definitely are compatible with Christianity, although not everything there can, of course, be accepted, because some of their beliefs were pagan and were not exactly what the Bible tells us. But to understand things properly, you need to use the religious perspective. You need to look at it from the perspective of Christian belief. All philosophical ideas overall could be seen as either obstacles or vehicles on our journey to God. So Platonism is, of course, for the most part, vehicle on a journey to God. It helps us to get to God and understand God. But some things may be obstacles. The idea, however, for him, again, you should get to God. The God or the truth is where you should be headed. All the material things are a distraction. Knowledge, philosophy, the world, humanity, always have to be understood from this religious perspective, because he is very, very devoted Christian from the time of his conversion. Now, the question of Holy Trinity, that was another important one. He wrote the whole work on it. At the time, they were really struggling with it. What is the problem? The problem is this. Christianity is monotheistic religion, right? Essentially one God. But we have one God, the Father, also His Son, the Christ, and also Holy Spirit. Doesn't it seem like three gods? That was kind of a problem they were trying to solve. Because note that when the foundation, the Bible, the Old Testament, for the Jewish people, always had just one God. Now when the Christ entered the picture, so to say, there was already kind of a problem. How do you exactly square it? Because He's Son of God. But what exactly does it mean? God did not exactly father Him in the same way that human beings father each other. So that's already kind of problematic. And then there were suggestions that perhaps He is God. So that's the same person. But then the problem is, so the God was crucified? Died? The God died. That doesn't make any sense. So that was rejected. How are they exactly related? So they actually used some of this Greek ideas, in particular the idea of a substance. A substance. They share the same substance. God has the same substance as His Son, who has the same substance as Holy Spirit. And they are kind of co-equal. So it is kind of one God, and yet He is in three different forms, so to say. Three forms of the same substance. Right? So this Greek idea, which we talked about a little bit earlier, came back and was kind of used to explain that problem. Two central issues for Augustine himself: the primacy of the will, which is what we discussed, and the second important issue is motivation of love, both human and divine love. The will is moved in the direction of what it chooses to love. So if you choose to love these eternal truths, God, then you will head in that direction. If you choose to love the material things, changing things, you will head in that direction. And you do have a complete freedom of choice in that respect. My weight is my love. Wherever I am carried, my love is carrying me. So you choose your telos, your goal. And then that determines how you behave throughout your life. Now, there is additional problem with freedom of the will and grace, which he addresses in another work, and it was, again, was a substantial problem at the time. Now, it basically goes like this. Adam, as we all know, has sinned. Now, when Adam sinned, God has basically drove him and Eve away from the paradise, and this is kind of a downward spiral from there. The human race is infected with this sin. All of us now carry part of it. So this is kind of one of those tensions which has been created. How do you reconcile the total power of God and the effects of this sinful nature on one hand and the free will on the other hand? It is a very difficult theological questions among other ones. Basically, again, different denominations explain it a little bit differently, but the idea is still that the sin of Adam makes all of us now sinful by nature. We all carry this sin with us. Okay, let's take a poll. Since Augustine believes that what we love determines how we reason, can reason ever guide our love? Do you actually guys believe that or not? Can you reason yourself towards loving something? Or is that kind of a more of a natural thing and your reason only follows your natural inclination and cannot direct you. Let's see what you guys think. So I guess, how should we do it? Can reason ever guide our love? Yes or no? What do you think? Can reason guide our love? Okay, I'll give it 5 more seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Not many people are participating in class. So 6 people think yes and 3 people think no. That is, of course, a big question, because you can see what's at stake here. If Augustine is right, then reason should be able to guide our love. We should direct our love towards God. But, of course, this is where also this problem of the original sin comes back, because the idea there is that we are sinful by nature, and only some of us get a grace from God in order to avoid that. There was a slide about grace. I don't remember where it is exactly. Well, anyway, the idea of grace. Grace is given by God only to some people. Grace is like absolvation of this sinful nature, the punishment of Adam. And some people question, how fair is it? How fair is it that some people get it and other people don't? The answer traditionally given is this, that people owe God something. And suppose 10 people owe you money, right? And you forgive one of them. You say, okay, you, my friend, don't have to give it back. Now, is that unfair to other 9 people? Most people would say no, because they owe you money, they still owe you money. It's up to you to forgive debt to a particular person. You don't have to explain to the others. You are not obligated to forgive it to anybody. So the same way they reason about whether God has to be able to absolve us from the Adam sin, he gives this grace to some people. And why is it important? Because our reasoning ability also affected by our by this grace. Only people who are given grace are able to reason clearly. Nobody else is able to reason clearly. People's reason is kind of corrupted by this original sin of Adam. And for this reason, we are kind of diverted towards the sinful choices. Again, kind of not even through our own fault, but through the fault of Adam, which becomes kind of our own fault because he is human just as we are. It's a difficult, like I said, theological issue, and there are different answers on that. Whether or not we will see how it will be later answered by Aquinas. Next time we'll talk about Aquinas. Aquinas lived quite a long time after, like about 1,000 years after Augustine, but he still picks up the same questions. So for Augustine, the truth is within us. So in order to know things, we don't have to look outside. We have to look inside ourselves. If we look inside ourselves, this is where we find the truth. Because the truth and the God is inside each and every person. God and the truth is the same thing, because God is the author of truth. Now, he rejected skepticism. He was talking about it in one of his earliest work against the academics. And remember, Plato's Academy was becoming skeptical. So essentially that is what he was objecting against. The later development of Plato's philosophy towards skepticism, he will say, no, actually skeptics are wrong, and he was bringing all sorts of arguments against this. His major idea is that even though skeptics saying that nothing can be known, and assent should not be given to anything, but that itself is suggesting that something can be known, that nothing can be known. He, however, believed that you can obtain knowledge, because if you believe in God, the God is the truth, and so you will be able to reach the truth. God is the source of truth. And he again brings mathematics, things like 3 times 3 equal 9. There you go. He's saying that's the truth. And you may be as skeptical as you want about some other things, but this is not what you can be skeptical about. And so for this reason, the part of those things which are changing, the changeable world, you cannot know it indeed. That's what the Greeks were saying too. Yeah, you cannot know it, but you don't even have to know it, because that's not what you should care about. What you should care about, the internal truths and God, they can be known, and they are as clear as 2 plus 2 equal 4. So for this reason, there's no skepticism there. How do you do that? You begin with yourself, you look inside yourself, and that's where you will find the truth. Now, again, that is not happening automatically. You do require divine illumination. It's kind of like the Plato's recollection. Remember, Plato had this idea that we can recollect the truth from previous life. However, for Augustine, that's not possible, because he does not believe we had a previous life. That's not a Christian belief. Christians did not think that souls keep on being reborn as somebody else all the time, even though soul may have afterlife, but that afterlife is no longer as another person. And certainly you were not another person before you were born. That part is not allowed. But nonetheless, divine illumination would be something which is kind of inside of us and can be found and discovered, just kind of like a recollection type of thing. He calls it cognition, from cogito, or I recollect. So similar idea. In fact, that just means that all the truths are already within us, and you can kind of reawaken them by directing yourself in the correct way. Now, faith and reason, reason cannot function properly apart from faith. Now, in that sense, he does not think that if you don't have faith, you can still use your reason. Your reason would not work very well. Faith seeks, understanding finds. Whence the prophet says, unless you believe, you shall not understand. That was actually in the reading. So, unless you believe, you shall not understand. First, you have to believe in God. Then you can use your reason to understand Him. If you start using your reason before that, in your search for God, you will not get anywhere, because faith has to come first. Now, the existence of God, he does not specifically address it, unlike Aquinas, who will try to come up with actual arguments for the existence of God. But overall, he just doesn't see any need to prove the existence of God, because he thinks it is rather self-evident. The very order changes movement in the universe, the very beauty of form and what is visible, proclaim, however silently, both that world was created and also that its creator could be none other than God. So to him it is rather obvious that the world was created and created by God. The creation itself, well, of course he does follow the Bible here. He says the God created the world from nothing, ex nihilo, not how the Greeks were thinking. Remember, for the Greeks, the world existed pretty much always, and even Plato in Timaeus saying that demiurg just took the matter which was already there and put it together into the world. The forms were already there, the matter was already there, he just shaped it up. But for Augustine, God created the world. There was no world, but God created it. This creation was the act of divine freedom, so he didn't have to do it, but nonetheless he did that because he wanted to share his goodness with his creatures. Not out of necessity, but out of his own goodwill. Now the world is composed of form and matter. The world of particulars is based on eternal forms that exist in God's mind. So all these Platonic forms, they are in God's mind, so to say, and the world is created according to those forms, which is why again he preserves this Platonic idea of the forms of everything. Matter is changing. Forms do not change, but matter is changing. But for him, unlike for Neoplatonists, matter is not necessarily evil. It's just if you choose matter, that's the way towards evil, because you are going further away from God. But matter in itself is neither evil nor good. It's just some sort of stuff. Biological species emerged from seminal forms. God planted those rational seeds which in the future begin to emerge. Not like evolution. Evolution, remember, tells us that the species were evolving. So at first there may have been a fish, then it came on shore, it became some sort of an animal, then that animal slowly turned into a more complex animal, and so on. Now in this case, there were the seeds which God planted right away, but later on they turned into already man and animals and all sorts of other things. And very important part, which actually will also serve as an explanation to many things, that God created time. So you cannot ask the question like, when was the world created, for example? When the world was created, there was no time. God himself is outside of time. The world was created with time as part of it. So for this reason, we cannot, for example, imagine God sitting somewhere before creation of the world in a year, I don't know, negative 5,550 or whatever, because prior to the creation of the world there was simply no time whatsoever. Now, well, we talked a little bit about this already. For knowledge, providence, and free will, I kind of explained it, so I'm not going to dwell on it anymore. Do you agree with Augustine that divine foreknowledge is compatible with human freedom? So that's basically what we talked about, the answer from the book. Do you agree with that, guys, or not? Let's do another poll on that. Let's see what you think. Did he explain it satisfactorily? Okay, well, we should wrap it up again. 1, 2, and 3. One more person took part in this poll. So now majority says no, that's actually not compatible. Okay, well, but you have to realize that if it's not compatible, then we do have a problem with religious belief in general, because that creates the following problem. Why do evil exist? And if you believe in God, and if you believe God is all powerful and all good, and in the same time if you think that human beings do not have freedom, then you have to admit that God created evil and he is responsible for all the evil. right? So this is actually the attempt to answer that. I'm hoping then that all the 7 people who said no are not Christians and not religious, because if you are, then you clearly have a problem here. From Christian point of view, they have to be compatible. Otherwise, it's just impossible to reconcile the all-powerful, all-good God and evil, especially the evil done by human beings. So essentially then what you are saying is when, for example, mass murderer goes and kills all these people, he does so because God has made him do so. He has no freedom, right? He has no freedom of the will. And God already knew he will do so, so God just essentially did it himself. That then is blamed on God. God just went alone and murdered all these people. There doesn't seem to be any way around it other than to say that it is compatible. It is compatible that God knew about it, and yet he is not responsible, because we have freedom of the will and we have freely choose whether or not to do that. Okay, well, let's not dwell on this stuff because we're kind of starting to run out of time. The problem of evil is generally a big problem for Christianity, for religious belief of any persuasion, because there's always that question, like, why does evil exist? So this is kind of an answer which is given by Augustine and by Christians in general. While some things may seem evil, they are instrumental ways of achieving good, like vaccination, difficulties in your life. You may say something bad happened to you. Well, it's actually a lesson. That's the way for you to learn something, and so on. Another answer, in addition to that, is that evil is not an independent reality, but a type of privation, lack of something, like a shadow, right? Everything that is not God will necessarily have some sort of imperfection. God is perfectly good, so everything else is, at least to some degree, evil. And finally, the human perversity has to be to blame. The moral evil, in this case, the only genuine evil, like what human beings do, because you cannot say volcano eruption is evil, that's just a natural process. But if somebody willingly goes and like murders or rapes somebody, or does any other evil deed, that is the production of human will. That is the only reasonable explanation of that. Outside of like saying, well, if everything is determined, then there's simply no God. That's another option. You can say, yeah, there's no freedom of the will because there's no God. We all fully determined, and everything that happens out of necessity by nature. Just like the stone falls down when you let it go, so the human being kills because some chemicals in his brain make him do that. And so you really can't even blame him for this. This was meant to happen all along, because that's how laws of nature determined that. But of course, from a Christian point of view, that cannot be the answer. Now, he, like I said, also was the originator of philosophy of history and the state, in a sense, because the City of God, his work specifically addressed this idea that history is not to be seen just like one damn thing happening after another. For the Greeks never thought about history as in this sense. History to the Greeks, to the classical Greek philosophers, was just kind of a bunch of stuff happening. They didn't see any pattern in it. Now, for Augustine, for the first time, he sees that as some sort of development leading to a particular goal and having some sort of a meaning. History as something meaningful. So City of God, that's a rather large and interesting book, is specifically the book which addresses this idea. It was provoked by the fall of Rome. The Rome was sacked for the first time by the Goths in 410. It didn't completely fall because the Goths were driven away. They will come back later. But at that time, they just came, they sacked it, they raped the women, they took some goods, and then they left. And it was huge shock for the Romans, because it could be somewhat compared to September 11th here in America, right? Suddenly, the city of Rome, the capital of this kingdom, of the empire, sacked by a bunch of hooligans, essentially. That impressed a lot of people, and one of the ways to answer this was many pagans were saying that's because of Christianity. The Christianity is to blame. When we had our gods like Jupiter and so on, everything was great. And look, we started believing in this Jesus Christ, and now these bad things are happening to us. That definitely is because of all the Christians. And many people are still pagan, and to them that was the argument. The gods are mad at us now. The real gods mad at us for believing in this figure of Jesus Christ. So City of God is his attempt to answer these concerns and to tell people that that's actually not how it really is. In City of God, he presents this idea that it's the other way around. The Rome has morally deteriorated, and that is why it did get punished. It's not because of the Christianity, it's because it's not living up to this standard of Christianity. So he compares the two cities, a city of the world, a selfish city, and the city of God, or love of God. And he is saying that as long as we select the first one, the city of the world, we deserve to be punished. And he's saying what we see then is that two societies have issued from one kind of love. Worldly society has flowered from a selfish love, which dared to despise even God, whereas the communion of saints is rooted in a love of God that is ready to trample on self. In a word, this latter relies on the Lord, whereas the other boasts that it can get along by itself. And so Rome was not the city of God. Rome was the city of the world. And he actually describes all these gladiator battles and so on as an examples of that. And for this reason, Rome was rightfully punished. The state in itself is, for Augustine, is necessary evil. It has to be allowed, but the only true community is the community of faithful believers. Okay, we have only 1 minute left. I want to address next reading a little bit just to explain to you guys something so that you would not be too surprised. Because sometimes students read it and they say, I don't understand what's going on. This is from Aquinas' work Summa Theologica. It's written in a particular way. So first he asks the question there, right? Then he presents objections or incorrect opinions. So don't confuse it with his own opinions. Then he gives answers to these incorrect opinions, which starts with on the contrary. Now, only after that he gives his own view and arguments in the defense of his own view, and then he gives separate replies to each opinion. So it may seem like he's contradicting himself if you just start reading it, and like I said, many students are confused by this, which is why I want to make it clear right away. So again, after the question which he poses, such as, does God exist? That's kind of one of the most important questions in the reading. He presents objections to that. He presents the wrong views, incorrect opinions. And only after that, he kind of gets to whatever he considers correct opinions and his own opinion. So it may seem like contradiction. It's not a contradiction. This is the way they were doing that. So please do the reading for the next time, because again, it will be very interesting and we will discuss it in more detail. Okay, otherwise we are out of time now. So that's all we have for today. And I hope to pick it up on Monday and talk to you some more about Aquinas.